we move to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. In case you've been asleep for the last semester, China is the dominant power in East Asia. It plays a similar role in East Asia that the Roman Empire played in Europe, but it's almost as if the story with China is that it's the Roman Empire that never completely fell. So China basically influences all of East Asia very directly and in an overpowering kind of way. The countries we will talk about have all experienced that influence directly. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, all of whom share the distinction of being tributary states of the Chinese Empire at varying points in history and with varying dynasties. So you're going to see Chinese influence in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam in superficial ways and in more substantive ways. So this, for example, is a portrait of Prime Minister Sin Sukchu. Sin Sukchu is painted in the style that Chinese portraitors paint Confucian bureaucrats. Also, in terms of more substantive similarities, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all adopt Buddhism that had China as its entry point, Mahayana Buddhism, and that also includes Zen Buddhism. Sometimes that influence, though, is not because Korea, Japan, and China were all members of, like, the China fan club. The fact is that China periodically invades Vietnam and Korea, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. We've also already talked about the critical importance of trade with Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, but Vietnam specifically with the Champa rice. All hail the glorious Champa rice. Now, if you put these countries on a spectrum, Korea probably has the most direct Chinese influences, and that's partially because of its close proximity to China, and also because the other two have sort of limiting factors for Chinese influence. Japan is, of course, on an island, and Japan goes through long periods of its history where it's fairly isolationist. And in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam's in Southeast Asia, and the terrain is often covered in jungle and marshy terrain, which of course makes trade and communication somewhat complicated. As far as we know, the first Japanese people probably came from Korea, but that being said, we just don't really know. We know that modern-day Japanese people bear an uncanny genetic similarity with the present-day inhabitants of Korea, but again, that's not necessarily confirmed. What we also know is that the Japanese language is pretty much a language isolate, not all that different from Sumerian. The Japonic language family has a few relatives, but most of those relatives are pretty closely related to the Japanese people themselves, like, for example, the inhabitants of the Ryukyu Islands, the Okinawans, etc. There are some proposed relationships between the Japanese language and the Korean language, but that's not been confirmed. To show you how different the Japanese language is from pretty much any other language in that region. At first, linguists proposed a connection between Japanese and Turkish, or Japanese and Mongolian. So it's very different than Chinese. That is going to be important in just a little bit. The dominant political figure in the early post-classical Japanese period is, of course, the figure of the emperor. The oldest verifiable emperor that we have historical evidence of is the Emperor Kinmu, who basically rules in the 500 CE. The Emperor Jimmu, which is possibly a legendary figure, emerges, I think, in around the 5 to 600 BCE. So again, it sort of depends upon how you or what you believe, I suppose. But what we do know is that in the 5th century, these emperors emerged from the Yamato clan, making the Yamato clan the most powerful in Japan. And of course, we sometimes call this period the Yamato period. You might recall that this is around the time period of the Tang Dynasty, and let's just say the Yamato noticed. The Tang were pretty swole, pretty powerful. So what they began is they began a series of reforms to sort of emulate the success of the Tang. These reforms are broadly called sinification, which refers to basically adopting Chinese practices, culture, etc. The Taika reforms, implemented by an emperor by the name of Kotoku, um, this spans a period of about 5 years, which is kind of weird because we call this the Taika period, and the Taika period is a very short period of time. It refers to this desire to emulate what made the Tang Dynasty work. So that includes, for example, copying sort of veneration of the emperor in Japan in the same way that the Tang emperor was. An attempt to develop bureaucracy to limit the power of the aristocracy, and of course, the adoption of Confucianism. One of the things that also happens is that around the same time period, sinification goes a bit further because you also see the adoption of China's writing system. Now, that's not going to be the end of the story. The story is actually going to get a lot more complicated, but you have this weird situation where you have the Japanese language, which develops pretty much in isolation from Chinese, but it uses the Chinese written language. For the most part, in Chinese history, the moral of the story or the TLDR of the story is that pretty much the scholar bureaucrats are mostly more powerful than the aristocrats or the warlords. If you look at Japanese history, however, it's actually the opposite. The aristocrats are always going to be much more powerful. And so what happens is this attempt to sort of like astroturf Confucianism on top of Japanese society, it fails pretty epically. In 794, we have the beginning of the Heian period. One of the things about Japanese history is that there's a tendency to name periods of time after capital cities, and usually capital cities tend to rotate depending upon who is actually in charge. So the capital is actually moved from Nara to Heian, and we suspect that one of the reasons for that is that the Emperor Kamu basically wanted to get rid or sort of get some space from all the Buddhists who were dominating the city of Nara. Heian, or eventually Kyoto, will become the official residence of the Japanese emperors until about the time of the Meiji Restoration. So basically, the emperors rule there for over 1,000 years. Quick note about the emperors is that remember that the emperors are semi-divine figures. They claim direct descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. And for the most part, the modern-day Japanese emperors are direct descendants from individuals like Kamu. It's basically, kind of a monarchical achievement to have such a long-lived dynasty with pretty much unbroken succession. But it's while Japan's emperors were hanging out in Heian that they started to develop more authentic Japanese traditions. It's almost as if you can kind of detect this sense of nativism take over Japan, which is something they also sort of share with China in the sense that you go through long periods of Japanese history where the Japanese sort of become suspicious of foreign influences, which again is not something that is unique to either society, but you do see some, significant upticks in the sentiment throughout periods of history. So in 838, for example, the Japanese embassies to the Tang Dynasty stopped. You see the abandonment of the Taika reforms, and probably most importantly, you see the power of aristocratic families increase. This is especially the case with the Fujiwara family. The Fujiwara family basically intermarries with the imperial family, and eventually the power of the Fujiwara family basically becomes the power behind the imperial throne. The Heian period is considered an artistic, literary, and cultural golden age for Japan. A lot of the things that we kind of naturally associate with being like foundational parts of Japanese culture actually get their start in the Heian period. This is a period where education levels were comparatively high, especially in the aristocracy. So individuals were learned in Confucianism, Chinese literature, painting, and poetry. It's also the time period where, you know, you start to see the emergence of things like koi fish ponds, just even the emergence of what we kind of consider to be Japanese aesthetics. One thing you could practically see from orbit in Japan around this time period is the extreme class consciousness and judginess of people who violated class-based norms. You can actually see this in the what could possibly be the very first true novel in human history, The Tale of Genji. The Tale of Genji is historically significant because, on the one hand, it is sort of a snapshot of what makes Heian court life function, but it's also kind of an indirect criticism of it. So first and foremost, notice who the novelist is. We have Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who is, writing sort of in defiance of traditions at the time period. Now, typically, any writing that was done was idealized to be done by men writing in classical Chinese. That is not how Lady Murasaki plays. Lady Murasaki wrote this novel, and she wrote it in a script that was used by women called the Kana script. As we'll actually discover, women are probably the most powerful movers and shakers in the evolution of Japanese linguistics. Women basically start altering the written language by adding hiragana and katakana. Hiragana is basically like a phonetic alphabet, and I'm not sure what significance katakana has. But basically, hiragana, katakana both fuse with the Chinese characters, which are called kanji. And that basically is what makes the modern day Japanese language. Genji is a story of the son of a Japanese emperor who is a bit of a ladies' man and seduces and woos many women at court. But it's also an indirect criticism of the very strict social hierarchy of the time. Genji is the most beloved son of the Japanese emperor, but because of court gossiping and jealousy, he is unable to make his son his official heir. Also, the Japanese emperor's concubine is literally bullied to death by gossip and rumor mongering. So, on the one hand, it perfectly encapsulates what's going on at the time, but because of its very honest and blunt depiction of Japanese court life, one has to wonder if it's not an indirect criticism of the same. While the court held an incredible amount of artistic and cultural power, it didn't really hold any significant amount of, let's say, military power. Real hard power was increasingly held by aristocrats in the countryside on these big manors and estates, not unlike, shall we say, European feudalism. And what happens is that a series of sort of poorly conceived tax policies gives many of these lords exemptions from paying tax, which you could imagine is probably not very effective because it means that the wealthiest people in Japanese society are effectively not paying tax to the national government. Not only do you have exemptions given to these aristocrats on financial matters, you also have this principle that the emperor cannot directly intervene in sort of matters or the estates occupied by the great families. So, for example, if fugitives ran away from the imperial government and sought refuge at the estate of a great lord, imperial authorities actually could not enter the estate to arrest the fugitive. So, as you can kind of see, In a lot of respects, despite the cultural similarities between Japan and China and how deep sinification has gone, in a lot of respects, Japan is kind of moving in the opposite direction of China. China, around this time period, is increasingly trying to centralize with the Tang Dynasty and with the creation of a powerful bureaucracy. At the same time, Japan is becoming more feudal, more federal, with power being held by the aristocracy. We'll pick up on that next time.